the forces of power that are dividing people who should be united, who need to be collaborating, those forces are at play in the world and oftentimes on social media and in these spaces where money has outsized influence. Cooperative and competitive dynamics, cooperation is inherently more powerful. And more powerful doesn't mean better. And the current dynamic has the people who are better able to cooperate are not the people who are in touch with planetary boundaries and everything like that.
If you want the game to change, the game that we're all playing, like you can't opt out. Ashley, what is game theory and how can it help us understand the metacrisis?
Yeah. Well, okay, any definition of game theory that fits into 2 minutes is not going to be to accurately convey it. But
luckily, we have an hour, yeah.
One definition that I'll use is it's the study of relational dynamics. And our system is built on top of relationships and relationships between individuals, relationships between groups. And so the study of that is really the study of the system we live within. And the metacrisis is, of course, the many different problems that manifest in different realms. All of those have relationships underneath them, like drives of people who care about things, could be good, could be evil, interacting with each other. So that would be my short 1 minute definition.
And there's a mathematical basis to this study, right? Like you're able to actually model these interactions and represent them in a sort of mathematical format.
Well, so it's a little bit like gravity. Like you can represent gravity through mathematics, right? And it's capturing a force, but that force is manifest in the real world. So game theory is the map. Human relationships are the territory, and to understand how to use the map properly, you need both of those. You need to be looking at both.
Right. So there's nuances that are more difficult to capture in the models. So yeah, that makes sense. So as far as the metacrisis goes, looking at it from a game theory standpoint, what are the kind of core patterns that we can identify, the core dynamics that are, at the heart of the metacrisis?
Yeah, I mean, I characterize this as a power to the powerful dynamic. So our current system has different people vying for power, and vying for power could be good or could be evil, because if there's things you care about, like the environment and like communities and, life on this planet, you're going to need power to invest in those social pursuits. But of course, once people start to pursue power for power's sake, that's where it can veer into the evil. And of course, people who do that are more likely to rise up in the system. So power to the powerful is basically just using the power you have to try to gain more power. And that is one of the main dynamics that I think is escalating in our system at present.
So is it fair to say then all these other kind of problems can be viewed as downstream of that initial pattern? So if why we can't solve climate change is because of this power to the powerful trap that we're in, where, the people in power, for various reasons, there's a selection bias of people who tend to gain power, but also their just general self-interest is now in conflict with, the environmental goals. Is that a fair way to kind of frame things?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying this episode, just a very quick reminder to like, comment, and of course, subscribe.
And if you want to hear more from Ashley on topics related to game theory and much, much more, please be sure to check out her channel, The New Enlightenment with Ashley. Is this dynamic of power to the powerful, is it just a natural feature of how humans operate, or do you identify it as like some sort of anomaly in the human condition? So there's like a separate group of people that behaves as such and then exploits the rest of us, or is that just a natural course of behavior that a human who gets into a position of power starts manifesting?
I think of it as inherent in many systems that people do pursue power for both good and evil reasons. I do think because we absorb values from people around us, and because there is a bias toward people who veer toward power for power's sake, leaning into those roles, there can be a tendency, it's certainly in our current system, toward as you rise up in the ranks, you have to absorb more and more ways of thinking about the world and ways of thinking about your position that are more likely to be sociopathic. But I do think there are a lot of people in positions of power that are genuinely altruistic. It's just that the space where we make sense of what is altruistic and what is selfish, that space is acted upon strategically. And
sorry to interrupt you, but who do you point to as somebody who holds power altruistically? If you had to cite a concrete individual.
A concrete individual. See, I don't usually use specific names. I mean, someone who uses power altruistically. I mean,
like Bill Gates. I mean, obviously, depending on who you are, you might think that's a controversial statement, but maybe there's a case to be made because he is extremely philanthropic.
It's a hot take, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people in these roles, people inside these institutions, I mean, the banality of evil is one of the things we started talking about, but it's sort of where you're in a position and you're having to decide, okay, I'm trying to live out the values I care about, which I get from an embodied viewpoint. The people around me socially care about these things and we point our attention toward what matters. And yet inside these institutions, the social values, the things that draw our attention, they're good. And sometimes we don't recognize the side effects 2 or 3 steps away outside of the institution we're operating within. And so I think a lot of people who are seeking power altruistically, they're doing it to live out good social values. And they're doing it from a position inside groups that care about really good things. It's just that it's possible for people to act strategically on groups. And I am convinced the in-group, out-group dynamic is one of the main things going on that's acting negatively in the system, that's causing us to not be able to make sense of what's going on or see the destruction that perhaps an institution we operate within is operating on.
Is that... sorry, Andre, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was going to ask if the in-group, out-group dynamic, when you combine it with power to the powerful, is that just exacerbating things? Because now the powerful are grouped together, and it's all the more difficult for the people with less power to try to, make change.
Absolutely. Like, I think that's one of the big things going on, is that nobody can see the breadth of reality from any one position inside the system. And people inside positions of power, oftentimes they have access to information that other people don't. They can see, how do the social dynamics work inside, say, an academic institution or inside an institution that's making economic decisions, like about interest rates or about loans that they make to people. They can see the details. Someone working inside a tech organization, they've worked with data and sort of understand how some of that works in a way that someone outside those institutions cannot. And yet people from outside the institutions can sometimes see the power dynamics that are intentionally sort of kept fuzzy and incomprehensible to people inside the institutions. And it requires, I think, getting a handle on the Metacrisis is going to require people who are sitting in different places, who have different perspectives, politically different social media feeds coming to them, different positions of power, humbling themselves and recognizing that, okay, I can only see part of the picture. And if I go too hard after people that I have this image in my head of what they're doing and why they're doing it and what's going on, then I'm going to be fighting the wrong people. It's going to require epistemic humility and a collaboration across people in different places in the system.
So we're doomed, in other words. Well, okay, so I do want to ask, just so we can illustrate this more concretely, what are the aspects of our current system, say in the U.S., that lend itself to the power to the powerful trap? Like, what is kind of, not aside from human nature, aside from that aspect, what are the systemic components that are kind of propping this up?
Yeah. And I think one of the problems I have with going on podcasts is I'm so careful when I come up with my specific examples. But okay, let me at least try.
Like, for example, from like an economic standpoint, right? Like you've got different sort of tax policy, like how that might contribute. I'm referring to those kind of concrete things.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. If you're comfortable talking about that.
Yeah. So let me use an example of private equity firms. So we have sort of an economic methodology that upholds what we think of as being valid and invalid. And in our current situation, private equity firms can buy up a bunch of small firms, including healthcare firms, all kinds of firms, and sort of restructure those and do what they want with those without transparency. Mm-hmm. And the system we kind of have in our mind, okay, if a business is successful, then it must be, at least in our minds, the way we think about it, it must be good for the population, because we think of, successful firms that, quote, serve the population will rise to the top, and those will be successful financially. So if this private equity firm is successful financially, then it must be doing something good for the population. And obviously that's not happening. Like, what's going on behind the screens where we can't fully see in these private equity firms is there's this restructuring that is oftentimes rejiggering how assets are managed, rejiggering the categories, the legal categories under which different parts of the business operate. And it's done in a way that's just making money for the people who own the organization, sometimes in a way that's really destructive to, say, the healthcare organizations that were once functional, but perhaps not perfect, but they come under the operation of the private equity, and the rejiggering of the rules inside just destroys the community that the private equity firm has bought interest in. So your original question, what was it?
It was the concrete elements that are responsible for kind of enabling the power to the powerful dynamic. Yeah.
So what's enabling these private equity firms are legal regulations and ways we think about how our system can and should operate that people who see the problems going on with private equity can't really see the places from which we can fix those problems. And so the fact that the power is pooled, and power includes the power of invisibility, the fact that once it moves inside the private equity firm, it's not accountable in certain ways because of the legal structure. And the system that allows that to happen is upheld by everyone. Like, people think this is valid, and it is valid according to the rules of the system, but it's valid in a way that moves power from the community that had perhaps the nursing home to the people who own the private equity. And there's not ways of fixing the social problems it causes. Okay, that was kind of messy, but yeah.
No. Is it fair to say then transparency and like information flow or lack thereof is one of these enabling elements of the power to the powerful? Like, if we had just a more clear picture of what was going on behind the scenes, then that kind of limits the power, right?
Yeah. I mean, information flow is one source of power. What's going on in people's minds, where people's attention is directed, is a source of power. And if people's attention can't be directed toward what is happening behind the veil of a private equity firm, then that is a flow of power. And I think there are so many dimensions of power that can be mixed and matched in this power to the powerful game.
So it's almost like information is one of those layers, but then attention in itself is also a vector of power. Because I think one of the most fascinating and successful elements of the political system in the US is that we do have quite a high level of transparency in a lot of our institutions via like the inspector general's offices that are attached to basically every government agency, and all that information is made public, but it's the consumption of that information that might not be happening at the level that some of the IGs and associated staff are happy about. So I'm thinking specifically, we're really going all over the place here, but bear with me. When the drawdown from Afghanistan happened under the Biden administration, there was this wave of panic that swept over everybody. Like, oh my gosh, like how did it ever get to this point that, the United States military presence there basically collapsed? But there was an organization called the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. The acronym is SIGAR, who that organization since like 2002 was publishing quarterly assessments of the effectiveness of the US presence in there. And for the 10 years leading up to the drawdown, they'd been ringing the bell and like, everything will collapse if the US is not involved in like X format. It happened. There was this wave of shock and surprise, but all of the information was there. Everything was available. You can access it today and go in the archives, but nobody was really, I guess, paying attention to it to that end. So it's almost like, fine, we resolved within our political system to a certain extent the issue of access to information, but then that attention lever is now actively being compromised by other systems that play around us.
Bingo. That is such a great example you just gave. Because I think that dynamic is so true for many different parts of our system, where it's not, in some cases the information is completely hidden behind closed doors, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is freely flowing. It's what I call the salience frame. That's one of the main concepts that I use in conceptualizing things, where salience frame is people's worldview and what comes into sharp focus and what's sort of on the fuzzy edges. Maybe people are aware of it, but not focused on it. And then what's just not even on the salience frame. And with the example you just gave, Afghanistan, for a lot of people, they might have occasionally consumed those reports you're talking about. I hadn't consumed those reports, but just because those reports pass through your information sphere at some point, if they remain in the fuzzy edges because they're not socially salient according to the people that are around you who are talking, who sort of bring emotional attention to different topics, then it's a little bit in one ear and out the other. And so it's the salience landscape. And what drives salience? It's a number of things, but it's emotions. It's sort of how relevant is it to the social people that we trust and value. It's what do we have agency over? If we feel like we don't have any say in it, like we can't actually do anything about it, then it can come in and out of our salience frame and it doesn't really get absorbed or brought to the forefront of our attention.
I think we also have to contend with the fact that there are just some things that are just not very interesting to people, right? Like there's some things that most people are not going to seek out on their own, when they could be playing a video game, where they could be going out dancing, where they could be just hanging out with friends or watching Netflix or anything, right? Like, so there's
you just established the in-group out-group dynamic. You just verified that entire concept.
I'm just saying, like, this is, just kind of like a human nature thing. And so I would feel like we would need some sort of systemic incentives, right? And like, if I was kind of designing a new society with like a new political structure and everything, participating in government and being and like understanding what's going on, and like reading things about how government works and what's currently happening and like actual details, like maybe that should be something that's a mandatory feature of a society where, hey, we know this is not the most interesting thing, but for our society to function, we actually have to be involved. And since people, generally speaking, aren't very inclined to be involved, you kind of maybe create some sort of incentive, whether it's a financial incentive, whether it's, hey, like if you don't do this, you're punished in some way. I don't know, but what do you think? Before like we get too deep into solutions, what do you think about that angle?
So yeah, I partially agree with it and partially don't. I mean, I think what people think of as interesting and uninteresting, it comes from sort of this social atmosphere where we live. And I mean, part of my job as a professor is to take things that could be super boring and to make them interesting by connecting them with real things they're connected to. Like if someone is not interested in the health of the planet or ecosystems. There are ways that that can be made interesting and salient. And if it's salient and if everyone around you is talking about it, then it's going to be more interesting to you. And I do think investment in directing attention to things that we collectively agree are the good things to attend to. I think our current systems don't do that well. And to some degree, that is the whole issue. It's not that things are inherently uninteresting or interesting. It's that we have lots of creative people who can make things interesting, and that can spread to groups. And once it's interesting to a group, people in that group and around that group will start to take an interest because it's going to be discussed over the water cooler. It's just the people who have the most influence over where attention gets directed, over who gets paid and not paid to make things interesting or not. The people with those levers of power, it's not in line with life on this.
Isn't it kind of a chicken and the egg problem? Like the reason that people and the more creative people tend to go into, Hollywood and work on, a drama or some action flick or something is because there's just more money to be made than trying to talk about the planet and ecological destruction and factory farms. Now, obviously, there's still people have made very compelling films and videos about those things, but the discrepancy might be explained by the fact that, well, there's that inherent interest that people have in the things that aren't going to make them, like factory farming, for example. I think it's a great thing. Like you can make that very interesting and fascinating and evoke a lot of emotion.
Sorry, the challenge to factory farming, not factory farming itself as a concept. Yeah. Yes, but the resident, okay, of course. Yeah.
But it's like, it's not a pleasant thought to be like, every time you go eat a burger or a chicken sandwich, it's not a pleasant thought to be thinking about all the animals that are like being tortured, right? And so there's a natural aversion to some of these things that I think you can only explain so much by the fact that, well, we just haven't made it compelling enough. I don't know. That's just, yeah. I don't disagree, though, that we could do a better job in the way that we present some of this information and make it more compelling. And that is part of why I think your channel is so good and has such a great audience. It's because of the way that you're able to neatly package some of these ideas that are otherwise difficult to understand and make it interesting. But yeah, sorry, I think you were going to say something.
Well, I mean, it is those high level incentives, like the structure of money. I think money has the ability to direct attention differently. Yeah. And the structure in Hollywood, the structure on social media, on YouTube, etc. I don't think money is directing creative efforts and attention and things in the optimal way. And I do think there are a way where dark things can become, I don't want to say palatable exactly, where it, like the population's attention can be directed even toward addressing dark things and transforming our attitude about them. And that's going wrong at the highest level of how money structures Hollywood, social media, etc. At the very highest level.
And we've had examples of like massive shifts in how our society works because of like popular culture or something like that. Like all like the early 20th century, I don't remember when the novel came out, but it was Upton Sinclair's writing, right? He was basically writing popular books that were consumed by the masses, but he was raising awareness to like working conditions for like children back when kids used to work in factories, I guess. But that did lead immediately to like a shift in how the public thought about child labor, working conditions, things like that. And it became socially unpalatable to support these sorts of things. And then the system reformed and now kids work in safe factories, I guess, or I guess they don't work in factories anymore. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say that these forces are always like directed at things that are the antithesis of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think any layer of the system, including the highest layer of directing money has both power forces and good forces at play. And what you're talking about is an instance where, okay, somebody came in with sort of an ethical orientation to the world, and they created something creative, and that was able to manifest. I think that happens today too as well. It's a blend.
Yeah, I agree. Although it does seem like it's mostly the bleak stuff, but yeah.
Okay, so I guess to maybe touch on some other kind of core dynamics behind the Metacrisis, what about tragedy of the commons? I mean, you still see a downstream of power to the powerful in the sense that it need not be a tragedy if the powerful weren't so powerful or not interested in actually solving these things because it doesn't benefit them personally. Is that how you would frame kind of the hierarchy of these dynamics?
No, I mean, there are people. I think at every layer there are people. I don't tend to think of it as benefiting them personally. I tend to think of people have layers. There's individual things they care about. There's things their community cares about. And I think most people in power, including sociopaths, they're in communities that have social values, including good social values. And they're vying to do the best for the different layers, themselves individually, but I think way more often, it's the communities they're embedded in who define what they perceive to be good social values for the world. It's just that there's a blindness to the social values that go against their end group, which oftentimes includes like the disempowerment of people outside of roles of power and the disempowerment of people who care about things that they are currently harming. People don't want to look at the bad things they're doing, so there tends to create a blindness around that.
Okay. But as far as something like the tragedy of the commons, which, by the way, if you could explain that to the audience who may not be, they probably are familiar with it, most of the people listening, but if you could just explain that and then maybe explain why that's been difficult for us to resolve.
Well, the tragedy of the commons is one game theory dynamic where there's a common space and everyone has an incentive to negatively contribute a little bit. So like the classic example is overfishing a little bit from a pond, where when everybody does this, it depletes the resource. And it's hard to blame any one individual because they're only overfishing a little bit. But collectively, when you add up the effect, it's destructive. And I mean, the way this is solved, like Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, is through institutions where you sort of come together and say, okay, we can't sustain the fish population in this pond unless everyone limits their fish to this amount. So we're going to police each other and make sure all of the neighbors only fish this amount. And that's an institution that's both social and official, and it's intended to protect that resource.
Okay. So what could that look like for some of the challenges that we're facing today when it comes to, say, a climate change? Do you think that's a global governance issue?
Well, so with institutional economics, there's both official institutions, that the rules we set out for ourselves, and unofficial institutions, which I refer to as institutions of the heart, which are sort of, I mean, that's like the social, what gets social accolades, what gets attention, what gets scorn and disgust. And to some degree, these two things have to go together. They can't work in opposition. You can't have a set of rules that people are not on board upholding socially, because most enforcement of this kind of thing is not done mechanistically, it's done socially. And you need those to go in the same direction. So is it a governance problem? Yes, but the governance problem is mostly in institutions of the heart. It mostly has to do with attention and salience, at least the way I think about game theory. Most game theory is coming from the gut. It's not deliberative. And that's what's affecting systems that are not working.
Okay, so how can we shift those gut reactions?
How do you win hearts and minds, I suppose, to that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it goes back to the way our society directs attention and the way we think about, I guess the two realms here. And I realize it's kind of theoretical, but we've been talking about the salience frames. Who has the power to direct salience frames? And social media is playing a big role there. I do think our governance over social media is not serving us well right now. And that would be one area of opportunity to redirect people's attention. But I think there would need to be more democratic forces at play deciding where attention gets directed.
Interesting.
And then the other is sort of a shift in how we think, which is why I'm obsessed with the book The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist, where he kind of lays out either or thinking versus both and thinking, where either or is sort of the battle thinking, where it's us versus them and we're having a battle. Both and thinking is, okay, how are both of the parts of the either or valuable? And it's neither of those that's the solution that will get us there. It needs to be the both and that encompasses the either or. It needs to be, we're not going to get people out of battle mode. Like if we're expecting to direct human nature in a way where there aren't battles, that for one, that's not going to happen, but that also wouldn't be good because battles they direct our emotions, they direct our attention, and most productive activity does come from something that has a battle element to it. It's just the battle needs to be downstream of something that has a bigger cooperative perspective. So integrating the both and the either or, which I haven't figured out a good way of explaining this. I'm working on it. But I do think there's
so when you say battle, you're referring to kind of competitive dynamics, right? And you're saying, well, that should be downstream, like a good goal as opposed to like a less good goal.
Yes, cooperative and competitive dynamics. Cooperation is inherently more powerful. And more powerful doesn't mean better. And the current dynamic has the people who are better able to cooperate are not the people who are in touch with planetary boundaries and everything like that. Right. But you can't get rid of the competitive as well. Like you need the competitive. It is downstream of the cooperative, and it's getting those forces in balance.
Do you think just social media, by like nature of how it functions, is it able to enable anything beyond that battle, beyond that, like exploiting that like foundational level of like competition in people? Like, is it even feasible to morph it into something more cooperative, or just that, like in the way that algorithms are coded? Like, isn't it just always going to amplify that sentiment of battle between one group versus another?
I don't think so. I think we're nowhere near anything that is healthy at present.
Well, yes.
But I think a lot of people really don't like the polarization and have no way there's just no agency for something that is healthier.
So there's something that I guess I'm not sure I'm maybe understanding you correctly, or maybe I just disagree with this, but you said a lot of what needs to change is kind of like institutions of the heart type of thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I guess, is dictated by the social media attention that's governing our salience frame. But I view the social media kind of the toxicity from the algorithms. I think that's downstream of the economic incentives. So then we're going back to, well, what is the economic structure? And then now that's an actual institution, not an institution of the heart. So it's like, I agree that, we need a cultural change. We need individuals to be more enlightened, etc. But I am struggling. It seems like you need to plug, like if you have a leaky bucket with multiple holes in it, like you can't just plug one, right? It's going to continue to leak. So you have to plug all of them kind of at the same time.
Yep.
Or at least or at least in this case, in this specific example with social media and institutions of the heart and attention and stuff. Well, you need to address the economic incentives for social media, which then can address the institutions of the heart thing. But then in order to have the political will and the cultural will to change that, I mean, I don't know, like you need to change the economic incentives. So it's kind of, it's a bit of a catch there. So how can we solve this if it requires like these kind of solutions in parallel, I guess?
Yeah. And I love the way you just framed that, because I feel like that gets at it perfectly, the snake eating its tail. Because my channel is, it's economics, knowledge systems, and governance, those three things. And those are the snake eating its tail. Is it governance? Well, yes. But governance feeds into both of the others, knowledge systems, how we understand what's true, salience frames, and economics. Economics, the one thing you said that I don't 100% agree with is that economic systems are not institutions of the heart. To a large degree, money itself, like the value of money, how we perceive the dollar, there is an institution of the heart behind that. And some of these things are so ingrained that people can't even imagine how could we loosen up our expectations around things that have been so fundamental for hundreds of years. But I do actually think that is the moment in history we live within, that there's going to need to be a really massive change in our economic systems. And that underpinning that, it is going to have to come from what we perceive to be valid economically. I mean, all the way down to things like debt and things like contracts between people. How do those get structured? What is valid? No, that's like too big for us to go into today, but I really like.
Yeah. Could you at least touch on it at a higher level?
A little bit of a teaser.
Some of the debt stuff, the contractual agreements. Like, can you just high level? What are some of those aspects that you'd like to see changed, and in what way?
Well, I mean, debt systems compound, and they restructure who has power over who can dictate what responsibilities do we consider to be most important. And I mean, an example here might be showing up to work on time. Our culture places a very heavy weight on that. Showing up to work late is very much frowned upon, but showing up to your nephew's baseball game late, like that's not a big deal, right? And that comes from structures of economic incentives. So if you're in debt and you need to show up to work, you will way prioritize showing up for an employer over keeping the stability of the family you live within, the community you live within, as a structure that matters. And because of that, a lot of the social structures, like extended families, like, communities that we see face to face and have relationships with, those are fraying at the edges. Those are coming apart. And an economic rejiggering of like how we prioritize things is going to need to, I think, shift back to communities of people that we have flesh and blood relationships with. And our current system doesn't do that. And debt is part of the story, because debt creates the obligation, which has a moral element to it, to show up on time to work. That's kind of the level at which I think things are going to need to be rethought. Okay. And David Graeber does a really good job in his book, Debt.
Now, someone could argue, say, well, this creates the incentive for innovation and growth, which is ultimately, it creates a positive sum atmosphere, and like it's, if you're not advocating for this, you're clearly just advocating for communism, and that's the only other alternative.
It's like we're listening to an argument between like two Italians, one from the Lombardy region in the north and one from Sicily, right? Like it's like that's the age-old like battle. Here we are. Right? It's productivity versus, I guess, like community, and which develops what kind of stability. So it is a difficult game to resolve to that end, right? Because to Yvonne's point, yeah, like if we start valuing these more, I don't even know what to call it, like blood ties, relations, over productivity, over like economic driving forces, would that not be like foregoing growth, I guess? Yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is why, how do we define growth? Like growth in what? And I mean, my critique on GDP, I feel like is also more broadly applicable here, which is we think of GDP as being a collective measure of well-being, because we think of it as, okay, markets, markets place, we almost think of it as markets placing equal value on everyone. And of course, because of income differences, markets overweigh the rich and underweigh the poor. But that's not even the level of my critique here, because I think rich versus poor is distracting us from what's really going on, which is the people that GDP is attuned to are not as much rich versus poor. It's more people with decision-making capacity inside large-scale institutions, which includes corporations, it includes government organizations. And usually I'll use the example of a furniture company that makes a decision for a corporate furniture inside restaurants across the country versus a furniture company that makes furniture for the rich versus the poor. The one that is the corporate decision maker, that person is going to direct way more dollars. GDP will be attuned to their decision making. And so there's this massive imbalance in who GDP is attuned to. And the same is true of growth and productivity in general. So, I'm not opposed to growth. I'm not a anti-growth person, but every measure we have of growth, it's attuned in such an imbalanced way that it's not actually attuned to the population. It's attuned to those with power.
Right. And totally just like twins. What is it? Siamese twins that are kind of born together. The ones that are together.
Oh, conjoined. I know what you're talking about.
I was forgetting. Yeah, conjoined twins. It's it's that GDP metric is also tied to the ecological impact, which is absolutely destructive. And so it just seems like everyone who, I don't know, maybe I've got a little bit of a bubble that I'm in, but everyone understands that GDP is not a good metric that we should be optimizing for. And yet nothing, it just continues to be optimized for. Right? I think there's actually a few countries that have a wellness index that they actually opt for. Yeah, which in Nepal is number one on that, or I guess before all the trouble. But it's also there becomes a problem where now if you're not focusing on, if you're let's say you have a thing you're optimizing for where you're actually now growing in terms of ecological regeneration and all these other community things, and you found a way to capture that with a metric, and you're growing in that domain, and your society's getting better. Well, now if you're not investing money in a military, and you're not investing money in technologies that may actually end up being used as weapons, and so you get outcompeted by the nation or the group that does. So how do you, I just don't see how you get away from some sort of global treaty on what is acceptable. And that goes back to a global governance issue. A lot of these problems, I feel even if you're able to solve it within your country, you're still, you still might fall prey to someone who's more, a group that is more aggressive and willing to kind of not prioritize the good things.
I guess, Ashley, maybe also to reframe it in a way that, let's say we do embark on a project within the United States, because this is where we live, this is what we know, to maybe rethink about how we characterize economic growth, right? If no other country in the world is doing that, would it not put the US, let's say, at a global disadvantage if we start moving away from the traditional markers and measurements of what a successful economy looks like? Would that, I guess, and none of this I actually believe in. I want to preface it by saying, but wouldn't it leave the United States vulnerable on a global position if our way of thinking about economic output shifts, but the rest of the world does not change in that way?
The way I view the game theory of the whole system, including the global system, is not exactly in line with what you just said. I don't think I can articulate that today. I would say I do believe that cooperation is inherently more powerful than competition. That is something I believe. And I think that is at play in the whole system as well. And the narrative of, if we don't do the thing that's bad for the environment or that's bad for human communities, then we will be outcompeted. I don't think, I think that narrative, it has a lot of truth in it. But I also think that narrative is being used to obscure the game theory of what's going on. And I definitely don't believe there's a metric that could be optimized for at all. Because to some degree, it's the empowerment of people who have the ability to perceive on the ground details about what matters in the communities they're in, what matters in the ecological systems they're part of. And of course, part of this is that people are too disconnected from the ecological systems. So there aren't people out there who deeply care about this plot of land and this pond and whatnot. So I guess that was a reaction to what you just said that sort of gave a little bit of, it's more just, I don't think about it in some of the ways that it's discussed in the general conversation.
So you said the competitive framing kind of obscures what's really going on, the actual game theory.
Okay, go ahead.
Bit. Yeah, no, I was going to ask, what is then actually going on from that global perspective?
This is the thing. It's a blend. It's like that is going on.
Okay.
But that is not the dominant force. That is not the only force. It's not the dominant force. It is not the force that if we solve that, things are solved.
Okay.
And I when I hear the conversation, I think there are a lot of people who view that as the dominant force, the competition as the dominant force. And I think this is true in ecological systems too. Cooperation is actually more powerful than competition. And what's needed is for cooperation among people without power, like a more distributed, a way of distributing power, such that cooperation is enabled more broadly rather than concentrated.
And hence what you say, the core problem, the core game theory trap with the Metacrisis is, well, the powerful tend to get more powerful, and they can make it less. They can make it more difficult for the people without power to cooperate, right? So it kind of comes full circle. So then I guess it begs the question, what would be the first step in the people without power from a game theory standpoint trying to organize and cooperate and kind of almost create power within themselves to then try to counteract the kind of existing, people or groups in power?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's about building up the types of power that we have the comparative advantage in, which are real relationships where you know the person one-on-one. It's virtue, which is a type of power that someone who's a sociopath cannot take on. And it's something that has to be cultivated over time, practicing speaking the truth, practicing, being honest. I think it's building up these things and shifting the way we think. I also think it's, there are a lot of ways that power operates in our system, including sort of the social media sphere. One of the reasons I stay separate from it, even though I recognize we need people in it, we need connection with people in it, we can't just ignore it. I am personally ignoring it quite a bit, is that the forces of power that are dividing people who should be united, who need to be collaborating, those forces are at play in the world and oftentimes on social media and in these spaces where money has outsized influence. And it's like an awareness that none of us are unimpacted by those things. And for us to actually effectively collaborate, I mean, I think epistemic humility is sort of at the foundation. It's an ability to recognize the way our social values are defined in those spaces, the things that draw our attention, that we respond to emotionally, that those forces have some of the power built into it, and discerning what is power pulling and what is not something any individual can do. It has to be collaborative. It has to be done in relationship with people who think differently than ourselves. That's kind of the way I think about it, the solution.
Okay. When you talk about epistemic humility, how do you, like, if you're trying to, I don't know what the word is here. If you're trying to foster that in someone, like what do you do? Like, how do you talk about it, and like, how do you try to get that development in them so they have that epistemic humility? Like, how do you go about that personally?
To some degree, I think it's leaning into the intuition that somebody that you strongly disagree with, and especially someone where you act against that group is, in your view, doing something wrong. They're the out group. Like, being aware of who is in your out group and recognizing there are things that can only be seen from inside that out group. And you don't know what those are, and being okay with not knowing what those are. That, okay, we need to foster a functional enough relationship between me and that person on the other side of the epistemic force field, such that I have the capacity to maybe eventually get a glimpse of that thing they can see that I cannot. And I think what's happening now, the problem is not that people don't understand across difference, because reality is way too deep to be understood by any one individual mind. The problem is that people are directing such what I call adversarial energy, but this can be just demeaning them or like having an attitude of arrogance. Oh, we understand reality, and those people are delusional. Like that's sort of the in-group, out-group epistemic perspective. That the attitude itself will drive away anyone with wisdom, right? You pick up, oh, this person is sort of getting their little arrogant kicks and their in-group self-righteousness out of demeaning people who in my group. And they can't see some things that we can see, but their attitude clearly communicates they're not interested in seeing that. And that creates a boundary.
So you're saying like the eat the rich movement is not going to be productive is what I'm hearing.
One among many. One among many.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. We do have to kind of escape the tribalism, right?
But I guess, like, oh man, all right. I apologize for this in advance.
Because, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I think. Yeah.
I just wanted to take that like thought exercise of epistemic humility, maybe back a little bit, like explore it. Like with regards to like, all right, let's go back to Germany in like in the late 30s. All right. How could it, let's say there are very clear in-group, out-groups at that time in Germany, right? And the Nazi party, let's say when it came to power, and I guess how do you find, or how do you practice epistemic humility when the out-group you are evaluating is so horrific, right? And like, what are the bounds of epistemic humility, I guess is what I'm trying to ask, in referencing like the reduced to Nazi stereotype.
Well, I mean, I think that the Nazi stereotype is one of the problems. Everybody views themselves as against
the Nazis.
Like that is literally, just to like categorize them with the Nazis and
right.
One and done. We've done our job. Now they are outside the limits. And I think that's happening across so many different realms. And sometimes it uses the Nazi analogy and sometimes it doesn't. But in crossing realms and getting to know people who have a different perspective, almost always the image in our heads of who those people are, what they think, the information stream they're consuming is not correct. The place where we're most likely to be delusional is across in-group, out-group boundaries. And I wouldn't at all apply the Nazi analogy. And this is not to say that there are groups that are mostly wrong. But I think when a group is mostly wrong, there's some realm where they are right. and mostly wrong, sort of categorizing them as being mostly wrong, that may be correct. They may be wrong 90% of the time. But the 10% of the time they're right, if that is ignored, then we will not get where we need to go. I mean, I think if this is yin yang, like it really is. It's like the 10% of the time they're right. That might mean in a particular situation, that situation is the 10%. So they're 90% right in that zoomed in situation. And our inability to contend with this, the fact that we use our model of who they are in our heads to understand the world and we project our model onto them, stops us from being able to perceive reality. And the only way for us to navigate to a better place from a game theory perspective is to interact with the on-the-ground reality, which is not the models in our heads.
I think what you're saying is true to a certain extent. I mean, you do have to find that common ground and try to build from that, right? Build from the 10% and try to empathize with it, right? In the situation that you were describing. But I'm not convinced, though, from a game theory standpoint, like that's always optimal. In fact, I think to me, that seems like a more, you would probably know this better, but like a generous tit for tat strategy. So like you kind of allow for a little bit of defection, but you like, I think like specifically that generous tit for tat strategy is like you allow someone to defect like twice, like you forgive them once, and then you still cooperate, and then if they do it again, then you also defect. But like, I think that strategy can be exploited, right? And so it really matters like where the disagreement is with the outgroup, right? If in that 90% is something that you can't really ignore, right? It's a type of like defection almost that is just impossible to reckon with, then you will be exploited. And I think, like I don't know how you go about solving that. I mean, I think that's where war happens, right? Like that's where violence emerges and something has to give, right? Like kind of almost like a new game is formed. Like the game's over. Like maybe nobody won, but the game's over. Or maybe the bad guys won, but like the game is now over. That specific game failed.
Already in identifying a bad guy, you are already wrong, Ivan. You've already.
Does that make sense? Kind of what I'm getting at.
Yes. I don't totally agree with the frame. Like game theory and tit for tat, these are all maps, right? So like whether you cooperate or defect, that's always from a particular perspective of what you perceive as what they want and what you want. What I'm talking about here when I'm talking about epistemic humility is about, and I use the analogy of the map, the lens, and the projector. So any worldview is a map for looking at the world, helps us navigate, tells us what to pay attention to. It's also a lens through which we perceive the world, but it's also a projector. We're also projecting onto the world something that is in our map and on our lens that sometimes we're projecting it on there. That's not actually what's out there. And both sides are doing that to each other. Like when there's sides that disagree, they have a map, a lens, and a projector. And the problem is when we're projecting things onto them that are not actually what they are or who they are. And so the analogy I use here is turning down the volume of the projector. It's not about, it's like letting go of your preconceived notions, which requires this kind of attention.
What if only one side is applying that? I think that's what I'm trying to get at. If only one side does, then that can put them at least a short-term disadvantage, right? And if they're not able to cope with that disadvantage, then that is when they've lost the game, is the way that I'm perceiving this.
So the way I perceive our side and their side, ultimately, is the people who approach things by turning down the volume of their projector, by leaning into epistemic humility, by taking risks even with leaning into epistemic humility, that is our side. And I think there's people in many, many different camps who have that approach. And that's the group of people who need to cooperate. And the boundaries of in-group and out-group that are defined by the current public discourse and social media and the political sphere, those boundaries are not the highest level boundaries for solving the meta crisis. So
sorry, maybe just to rephrase to make sure I'm getting this correctly. You're stating that this sort of approach transcends the current like left versus right like split in whatever country.
Yes.
It in fact gets down to the granular elements of how one person would approach another, and that's independent of their politics, independent of their anything, right? So the cooperation needs to be happening among the individuals that are willing to behave in that way.
Yes.
Which then eliminates this notion of like, oh, well, what if I approach somebody with a more, relaxed practice of epistemic humility? They do not, they'll take advantage of me. That's not the individual you should be cooperating with anyways. You need to find the individuals that agree to that sort of paradigm of thought and action.
Exactly.
Interesting. I like that.
No, that makes sense. That actually makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where, there's obviously a clear failure here, because the people on the extreme ends have the, megaphones, and the people that are more moderate, that are more sympathetic and trying to understand and cross the divide, like they are getting shunned in a certain way. But I think part of that, again, is you have an economic structure which incentivizes the social media to turn our salience frame, or it's not just, I don't want to just blame it on the social media algorithms and the economic incentives, because I think there's the biological layer of like, we are tribal in nature, like to a certain degree. We are, very much compelled by fear and like these more deep emotions. And that's what's being taken advantage of. But it's also there. It's also like ripe for being taken advantage of to a certain extent. So I think there has to be sort of a come to Jesus moment at an individual level where people realize their flaws as human beings. And I think a lot of people just don't. They're just extremely arrogant about what it means to be a human and what our strengths and weaknesses are. But
so in a pragmatic way, how does one go about identifying this sort of like fellow traveler, or like however you would describe this sort of super political, like just how do you find somebody else that we can cooperate in that way? Is there like a pragmatic like set series of steps, or like a hand sign that you give to somebody to be able to like effectively like identify, yes, this is in fact an adequate individual to cooperate with in that way?
I think this has to be done individually, like just based on intuition, based on on the ground relationships, based on it has to be done on a case to case by case basis, with one's best judgment as developed over time. And each person's judgment will have some bias built in, but that's why it needs to be a community, more people with different biases built in, and the thing is, I think what you just asked is a really good question. How do we find these people? Because so much is stacked against us for exactly the reason you were just talking about. It's the economic structures do sort of uplift and make louder the people who are not like this. And the people who have these abilities, I think, recognize that and retreat from the whole situation. They don't try because they know there is such epistemic arrogance out there that assuming epistemic arrogance is kind of a good rule of thumb, but it's a rule of thumb that will ultimately fail. And so it's going to have to require taking some risks, and who is worth taking a risk with. And that risk is not just like immediately come out, and you kind of have to build into a relationship slowly over time.
And would it be fair to say then also, just at a higher like level here, you have to participate in the game, right? If you want the game to change, the game that we're all playing, like you can't opt out, right? If you opt out, I mean, there's, good luck. Like, you can't have any complaints at that point. But you have to actually participate. You have to take risk. You have to put in effort to cooperate, right, with those individuals that are willing to cooperate, and then hopefully you form some sort of power. You gain some power. That group gains some power, some influence, and is able to then adjust the game in a way that is hopefully more favorable for everyone. That's more, just a better game. That's more pleasant for us, for the planet, for everyone and everything. Right? That's the goal. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Things are not trending in a good direction at the moment, but that can always change, I suppose.
Yeah, I think whether it changes does depend on the kinds of relationships built in the background. Because, this kind of building of relationships, it's not something that looks like it's successful in an incremental way. It's something where the necessary infrastructure, relational infrastructure, because we're talking game theory here, is built in the background. And in a moment when things suddenly do change, there's something to fall on that might not have been apparent, that infrastructure of relationships. And I want to comment on what you just said. I totally agree with what you just said. But I want to add, you do have to participate in the game, but you don't have to participate in all parts of the game. Like I mentioned that I don't do social media, and I tend to even just stay away from the information atmosphere there. And yet some people, their personal role needs to be engaging with social media. So it's on an individual basis. What part of the game is your part?
Sure. Yeah. What suits you? Yeah.
I'm curious, is it almost like from a professional standpoint, if you are kind of studying game theory, trying to observe it holistically as a method, does that sort of role you occupy almost demand stepping away from whatever is churning in like the popular narrative right now?
For me, that's sort of how I view my role. Is if I were to get too sucked into some of it, even though I think there are people who are deeply in it, who are doing great things, for me personally to do what I need to do, I need to stay a little bit apart.
Okay, yeah, that's totally fair. I think one final question before we wrap this up. Say we maybe two questions. So, what does a stable like game theory dynamic look like? What are kind of the features of that, and how can it persist and not devolve? Or I guess that's the same question really, because that would be if it's stable, then it should persist, right? But how I guess what could you give us some like image, some illustration of like, okay, this is what a stable situation would look like, where people wouldn't be defecting and people wouldn't be getting too powerful, type of thing.
Yeah, and
from a game theory standpoint,
the power of the powerful dynamic is natural, and by stability you mean like a system equilibrium that would avoid that power to the powerful dynamic. Yeah. Okay, and I want to say I'm not rejecting the question. It might sound for a minute like I'm rejecting the question. Stability. So a system can look stable if it's on the power to the powerful path. As a matter of fact, like, rewind to the 80s and 90s, in 2000s, when I was not really aware of any of this stuff, it seemed stable to me, but now looking back, I'm not kidding. The power of the powerful dynamic was at play, and the fact that it felt and seemed stable was certainly not good and not what we're going for. And certainly, I think there's going to have to be a very unstable moment to get us to something better. We're kind of at the escalated stages of these things. So I'm going to interpret your question as sort of after getting past that and assuming we're not going for the type of stability that has the power to the powerful dynamic just in motion. And part of my answer here would be distributed power, like power where every person has some ability to act in the system, I think will have some element that is inherently unstable to it. And the way a system would be structured would be to allow the instability to, in some ways to direct the instability toward the places where we most need growth in the system. So a lot of stability is sort of locking down and not allowing the power dynamic and all of its complexity to play out. Like just disempower everybody could be stable, but that's not what we're going for. So what we're going for, people being empowered, there will be an inherent instability. So it's really a matter of creating structures where the instability is properly targeted. And I think what that looks like, it is something like democratic decision-making mechanisms over what things are stabilized and what things have the battle active and thriving. If that made any sense.
No, it makes sense because you're in essence advocating for an anti-fragile system. Like according to how Nassim Taleb talks about this, right? Like you can create a system that seems stable, but it's actually very fragile, right? It doesn't have the ability to kind of mutate in a way that can adapt to new things that are happening, right? So I think that makes sense. Like you want to have some flexibility, which inherently involves a level of instability, but it's much more resilient, right? That's what you're kind of getting at. Yeah. That makes that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we've kind of come up on time, but this was a really, really interesting discussion. If people want to reach you or find your work, where can they go?
My YouTube channel on this topic is The New Enlightenment with Ashley.
Amazing branding. I love that.
Yeah, appropriately titled.
Yeah, that's right. I definitely feel like we hit on some topics that I am leading today, newly enlightened. So the brand is apt.
Yeah. It was enlightening for sure. So
really fun. Yeah, I loved how it was. We didn't know where it was going, and I didn't know where it was going, but it was.
It is called chaos.
It was chaotic in a really good way.
Yeah.
We'll put that on a t-shirt as an endorsement of our show.
Yeah, thanks again, Ashley. We really appreciate it.